Hey there, friends, it's Steve, your second, maybe your third favorite grandfather, back with another episode of Old Guy Insights. Hey, before we dive in, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and if you want to dig deeper, check out oldguyinsights.me. Hey, that's me. For more resources, no gimmicks, no sales pitch, just good factual information and real talk. Now, let me tell you why we're talking about Gaza today. Like a lot of folks, I've been hearing the news, headlines, and the arguments and the opinions flying around, and I realized something. I didn't actually know the full history. I had my assumptions, sure, but I wanted to understand the facts and not just let someone tell me what I should think. And I've made this as short as I felt I could to cover the basics, but there's always a lot more to dive into. Think of this as Gaza for Dummies, where I was the dummy. So to accomplish all that, I did what I always do when I want real answers. I started digging. I went through historical records, legal arguments, and expert analysis. And let me tell you, this issue is even more complicated than I thought. I learned a whole lot of new things. There are strong emotions on all sides, but when you put those emotions aside and just look at the facts, one thing becomes clear. The ownership of Gaza is murky. It's not as simple as people make it sound. In this episode, I'm going to share what I learned, and as always, I strongly encourage you to do your own research too. Don't just take my word for it or anybody's word. Challenge what you hear wherever it comes from, and look at the facts for yourself. So let's break this down together. All right, let's start with the basics. What does it mean for a place to be owned by a country? Well, in legal terms, a sovereign nation is an internationally recognized government that has full control over its land, makes its own laws, and has clear, defined borders. Think of the United States. We have our borders, we make our own rules, and no foreign power controls us. That's what sovereignty is. Now, here's the tricky part. Gaza is not a sovereign country. In fact, the last time Gaza was part of an internationally recognized sovereign nation was over 100 years ago, under the Ottoman Empire. That's right, the Ottomans. They ruled the region for centuries until they lost control in World War I in 1918. And since then, Gaza's status has been in a constant state of flux. So let's take a quick trip through history. 1918 to 1948, British control after World War I. Britain took over Gaza as part of the Palestine Mandate under the League of Nations. But Britain never owned Gaza. They were just administrating it. 1948 to 1967, Egypt took over where the Brits left off in 1948, and Israel declared independence. War broke out. By the end, Egypt controlled Gaza, not as its own territory, but as a military occupation. 1967 to 2005, Israeli occupation. In 1967, Israel won the Six-Day War and took control of Gaza from Egypt. It built settlements, established military rule, and governed the territory directly. 2005 to today, no clear sovereign at all. In 2005, Israel pulled out of Gaza, dismantling its settlements and withdrawing its troops. But instead of becoming an independent country, Gaza became a self-governing territory, wound up being controlled by Hamas, a militant group that seized power in 2007 after a conflict with the ruling group, the Palestinian Authority. So here's where we are today. Gaza is not an independent country. It's not part of Egypt. It's not part of Israel. It's a territory ruled by Hamas, but still deeply influenced by Israel, Egypt, and international forces. In other words, Gaza's status is a legal and political gray area. Hard to believe, but there are other parts of the world that are in the same political gray area. Now, let's be fair. Israel has a point in wanting to get rid of Hamas. For years, Hamas has fired rockets into Israeli towns, launched terrorist attacks, and built underground tunnels to smuggle weapons and fighters. No country would tolerate that on its border. Israel sees Hamas as an ongoing threat that has to be eliminated, not just for security, but for long-term stability. Hamas isn't just operating on its own. It gets support, weapons, and funding from outside groups and countries that share its goals. Iran is Hamas's biggest backer. The Iranian government provides Hamas with money, weapons, and military training because they see Hamas as part of their broader strategy to oppose Israel and expand their influence in the region. Now, Qatar has provided Hamas with financial aid, sometimes openly and sometimes through indirect channels. While Qatar says its funding is for humanitarian efforts in Gaza, critics argue that this money helps keep Hamas in power. It's a valid point. Now, Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militia in Lebanon, also supports Hamas militarily. They share Hamas's goal of fighting Israel and have worked together to coordinate attacks and weapons smuggling. So, when we talk about Hamas, we have to remember it's not just a group in Gaza acting alone. It's part of a bigger regional picture with powerful players using it to advance their own interests. Politics aside, let's talk about daily life in Gaza. It's horrible. Because for the people living there, this isn't just about borders and governments. It's about day-to-day survival. Gaza is or was home to around 2.3 million people packed into an area about the size of my beloved Detroit. It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and for years, it's been struggling with a humanitarian crisis that affects almost every aspect of daily life. Electricity is unreliable. Most homes only get 4 to 6 hours of power a day because Gaza's power plants can't keep up, and clean water is scarce. More than 90% of Gaza's water is unsafe to drink due to pollution and infrastructure damage. Unemployment is one of the highest in the world. Over 45% of adults and 65% of young people don't have jobs, and food insecurity is widespread. Many families rely on the UN aid just to eat. On top of all that, Gaza has been through multiple wars in the past 2 decades. Schools, hospitals, entire neighborhoods have been decimated, destroyed, and rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. The cycle repeats. And right now, with the latest war, things are worse than ever. The latest war didn't come out of nowhere. It started with one of the deadliest attacks in Israel's history. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a massive surprise attack on Israel. They fired over 4,000 rockets in a single day. Hamas fighters crossed the border, killing over 1,000 civilians and taking hundreds of hostages. Israeli towns near Gaza were left in devastation. Israel responded by launching one of its largest military operations in Gaza ever. Airstrikes hit hundreds of targets and Israeli ground troops moved in. The goal? Eliminate Hamas and prevent another attack like October 7th. But war isn't clean. Thousands of civilians have died, entire neighborhoods have been destroyed, and while Israel says it's targeting Hamas fighters and infrastructure, the reality is that in a place as crowded as Gaza, innocent people are caught in the crossfire. And here's the question. Even if Israel removes Hamas, what happens next? Let's say Hamas is completely defeated. What then? Does Israel take control of Gaza again? That would be a huge political and military challenge. I mean, does Israel want to govern 2.3 million people, especially in a hostile environment? Does the Palestinian Authority take over again? Maybe. But I can't forget that the Palestinian Authority lost control of Gaza in 2007 and hasn't been strong enough to take it back. Does the UN or another country step in? Well, that's possible. But no country has volunteered to take responsibility for governing Gaza. The reality is there's no clear plan. Right now, Israel is focused on removing Hamas, but there's no long-term strategy for who governs Gaza afterward. And that's a problem because history shows that if you remove one power without a replacement, chaos fills the gap. Some people have floated the idea of the U.S. stepping in, using its military to stabilize Gaza and then rebuilding it. But now, look, I'll be blunt. This is probably a very bad idea, but hang with me. Let me ask you this. Does anyone in the United States really want to send our sons and daughters to fight and die in Gaza? Do we really want another war like Iraq or Afghanistan with no clear end in sight? Sure, the U.S. has the military strength to take control, and rebuilding Gaza could even be profitable for American companies, but at what cost? And do you think the United States Veterans Administration would take care of our mentally and physically injured troops from serving in Gaza with all the problems the VA has lived through in the recent past? And here's something even more concerning. What happens back home? If the U.S. invades or is seen as an invader and occupies Gaza, there's a real risk that it fuels even more terrorist activity, not just in the Middle East, but right here in the United States. When people are displaced and feel like they've been invaded, resentment builds. That's normal. That resentment turns into anger, and that anger can lead to attacks on the very country they blame. Would occupying Gaza make America safer? Or would it make us a bigger target? In the U.S. and around the world, there have been huge protests in support of the Palestinian people. And let's be clear, raising awareness about suffering is understandable. People see the devastation in Gaza and they want to help. But here's the challenge. Protests alone don't change the deeper problems on the ground. A protest in New York? Start? Maybe. But it won't remove Hamas from power. A march in Washington? A start? Maybe. But it won't force Israel to change its security policy overnight. And a rally in London won't suddenly make the Palestinian Authority strong enough to govern Gaza. The real obstacles here after my research is Hamas's control, weak Palestinian leadership, and decades of conflict. They're not solved by slogans. The only way things change is through negotiations, political solutions, and international cooperation. And right now, none of that is happening. So what's the best case scenario? Well, in an ideal world, Gaza would govern itself peacefully, free from outside control. It would have a stable government, economic opportunities, and good relationships with its neighbors. Schools, hospitals, and businesses would thrive. People wouldn't live in fear of rockets or airstrikes. But for this to happen, three things need to change. Hamas would have to be removed without leaving a power vacuum. The Palestinian Authority would have to prove it can lead effectively. And the international community would have to support Gaza's rebuilding without allowing extremists to take over. And the problem? Right now, none of these things are in place. So while a peaceful, independent Gaza is the goal, it's not likely anytime soon. After all the research I did, I learned a lot of things, I've developed some new opinions, and here's what I'm walking away with. There's still no clear road for Gaza to become a sovereign nation. Without a strong government, outside help, and long-term stability, nothing changes. Gaza is stuck in a cycle. Hamas controls it. The Palestinian Authority is too weak to replace them. And Israel doesn't want to rule over it. And most importantly, the people of Gaza suffer the most. So, where does this leave us? Well, right now, it leaves us waiting because until leadership changes, no real solutions are on the table. That's the truth. No emotional takes, no easy answers, just the facts as they stand. So, what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and as always, you can check out oldguyinsights.me. That's me. For more information, I'll tell you what, I'll create a post with more details that I learned for reference that you can read and access. And until next time, as always, stay awesome, be kind to each other, and remember to do good things. See ya.